The 9,116th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Tor Wennesland, Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process. Mr. Philip Lazzarini, Commissioner General of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East. And Mr. Daniel Levy, President of the U.S. Middle East Project. It's so decided.
I now give the floor to Mr. Levy.
I would like to thank the Council and the Chinese Presidency in particular for allowing me to share some thoughts with you today. The events of earlier this month, covered in detail by Special Envoy Wennesland, are as concerning as they are predictable. To be very clear, Israelis deserve security, Palestinians deserve security. Excellencies, month in and month out, the Council meets to repeat its familiar condemnations, formulas and slogans. I want to use this opportunity to rethink and reappraise some assumptions and beliefs that may inadvertently contribute to the intractability of this conflict, to consider afresh reasons why it remains so prone to stalemate and human suffering. And I suggest to do this through 5 concepts that may assist us in such an endeavour. First, justice, the permanent dispossession and denial of the most basic rights and freedoms of the Palestinian people will never be a recipe for achieving sustainable security. This, the illegal blockade of Gaza and the unlawful occupation, represent forms of structural violence and collective punishment that we cannot ignore. While the need for a political horizon is acknowledged, the dimensions of that horizon seem to shrink and shrivel, becoming ever less ambitious. There can be no effective or prolonged approach to Gaza in isolation. It is part of the broader Israeli-Palestinian reality, whether in terms of security, the separation policy, or closure. And crucially, there is a need to respect international law across the board, whether in state responses to armed threats or partisan resistance against state occupation. I would also say in this context that there is a need for Palestinian political renewal, internal reconciliation and overcoming of divisions, as well as an international need to engage all relevant actors without applying unrealistic and selective preconditions. Second, equilibrium. Any attempt to resume negotiations between the parties without addressing power asymmetries is a hollow and redundant exercise. As Comfort Aero, president of the crisis group with whom my organization USMEP cooperates extensively, as Comfort noted to this council recently, the structural power imbalance between an occupying state and an occupied people must be acknowledged. A focus on relations of power rather than both sidesism may help offer clarity of thinking and policy. As an example, attempts at economic confidence building are consistently too little, too late, and too ephemeral when they are attempted under conditions of permanent occupation. This defies principles of harmony and reciprocity. And especially with global resources stretched thin, the Palestinian economic predicament should really be understood as one that is primarily a function of politically imposed obstacles on movement, borders, access to land, confiscation, demolitions, ever-expanding settlements, rather than the absence of charity. We've heard the briefing of UNRWA CG Lazzarini just now. There must be that economic commitment to a predictably resourced UNRWA capable of delivering services. And that's a security necessity, but it's also a commitment of a political nature to Palestinian refugees who continue to be denied a solution. Third, accountability. I've previously had the opportunity to highlight to this Council 2 core problems. a legitimacy deficit in Palestinian politics, and an accountability deficit vis-à-vis Israeli policies. It is Israel's actions as the powerful occupying party that preeminently determine the direction of travel. I would suggest profound shifts are occurring as a result of the unwillingness to hold Israel to account, not least on settlements. Recent months have witnessed a disturbing intensification of this trend, with the targeting of those least able to protect themselves and those most in the front line bearing witness to violations of international law. Following the shock expressed by the Secretary General over the number of Palestinian children killed and maimed by Israeli forces last year, we've just seen that same trend again this month in Gaza, as noted by Envoy Venezuelan and C.G. Lazzarini. We witnessed the killing of those who report on and expose these crimes, Shireen Abu Akleh being the latest journalist to pay with her life. And now I would draw your attention to the assault on those who document abuses and defend human rights, with Israel's actions against 6 prominent Palestinian civil society organizations, some funded by members in this room. A terrorist designation was made by the Israeli authorities against 6 NGOs. A number of countries went on record that compelling evidence had not been forthcoming. Now, these offices of these organizations have been raided and shuttered and their workers interrogated. A response limited to expressions of condemnation is too easily dismissed. It's impunity on steroids, and unfortunately, it encourages more of the same or even worse. There really should be practical consequences at a multilateral and bilateral level. We already have a hollowed-out Palestinian polity and economy, and this is now an attempt to emaciate Palestinian civil society. Fourth context. It's no exaggeration to characterize the current global disorder as a world in metamorphosis, dangerously combustible, while potentially rewarding if we can be innovative while realistic. In this respect, the Abraham Accords may be many things, but they cannot be a substitute or distraction from securing peace and the rights of Palestinians. And if not properly managed, normalization can risk further nurturing a misplaced Israeli sense that the Palestinians can be ignored and marginalized. It's also the case that international law and principles purported to be universal cannot be asserted only when it is convenient and then set aside when friends or allies appear in the role of perpetrator. Our world is too transparent. These things are noticed. Fifth and finally, architecture. I would suggest that contrary to the prevailing perception that everything is stuck and it's a stalemate, in actual fact, Israelis and Palestinians are passing through a quite profound transition. Talk of the eclipse of the two-state option is neither alarmist nor far-fetched. Rather, it's a sober and it's probably a behind-the-curve rendering of the lived reality. I would say that for Israel itself, the absence of an off-ramp on this journey towards a new paradigm should be a cause for concern, placing in jeopardy that country's future. Neither Palestinians nor Israelis will disappear, and finding a just way to live together has never been more urgent. This profound shift will, likely, over time, take every state represented here out of their comfort zone. Let me close by briefly explaining why. We know of certain developments that can at the same time be both politically uncomfortable but also politically salient. The increasingly weighty body of scholarly, legal and public opinion that has designated Israel to be perpetrating apartheid in the territories under its control is just such a development. A designation made by Palestinian scholars and institutes, later examined and endorsed by Israeli human rights organizations led by B'Tselem, has now become the legal designation made by Human Rights Watch and this year by Amnesty International. This is what a failure to generate accountability and to achieve two states looks like. As uncomfortable as I know it is for some, I urge this chamber not to underestimate the longer-term significance and traction of what is happening. At the Human Rights Council meetings in Geneva this March, states speaking on behalf of the Africa Group, the Arab Group, and the OIC Group all referenced this apartheid situation. And it will come as little surprise if this echoes and resonates in parts of the world that have experienced apartheid and settler colonialism and that have gone through decolonization. It is a paradigm that will also bring the discrimination faced by Palestinians as citizens of Israel into sharper relief. It must be a wake-up call. 75 years ago, this United Nations offered partition as the political paradigm for the Holy Land. Today, that land is de facto united under one dominion. Absent unprecedentedly far-reaching action to make good on partition, your successors in this chamber will come to debate the challenge of achieving equality under a reality of non-partition. Mr. President, if the Council seriously considers these 5 principles and their implications, we may find a way out of the repetitive impasse, the familiar condemnations, formula and slogans, and perhaps usher in a new opening and path to justice and equilibrium for Palestinians and Israelis. I thank Your Excellencies.
I thank Mr. Levy for your briefing just now.